Welcome to the very second of our Back to Basics workshops, where we all learn because we're not perfect and we don't know everything. We learn about all there is to do with the climate. We learn about, especially today, we learn about words that are used in the climate justice space. And other times we just learn about all the things that you might come across if you're an activist in this space. So this is our very second workshop, and we're very thrilled that you are here with us. I just need to share my. All right. So, is everyone able to see my screen? Awesome. It says Unpacking Climate Justice Jargon. This is a very exciting, very new, very fresh workshop that we're bringing to you today. My name is Mitchelle, and I am going to be one of the facilitators for this session. And joining me is Xoli. I'm going to let her introduce herself.
My name is Xoli. So I'm also facilitating this workshop today and looking forward to it.
Awesome stuff. Thanks, Xoli. So today we just really want to understand some of the words that are used in this space. What does it mean when someone says climate justice? Do you know, what does it mean when someone says climate justice jargon? What does it even mean to say jargon? Why are we even talking about the climate? What does it even mean to unpack? Right? So those are all of the questions that might be running through some of your minds, and we're here to answer some of them. So these are some of the goals for our workshop today. One is to bring a level to the climate space by breaking down some words that are normally thrown out in dialogue. And the second would be to make sure that we all understand what these words mean and how we can use them, simply because we've noticed that there's a bridge that needs to be, there's a gap that needs to be bridged when it comes to the climate activism space and the wording that is normally used. It's not usually common language. And so that is what we are going to be doing today. And to kick off, I just thought this was a humorous little comic thing. So I edited it in, and I'm going to read it, and then we are going to get to the gist of what it's really about. So the guy in the hat says, "Watch it, apples cause cancer." And the kid goes, "Oh my, I mean, no one wants to get cancer." The kid goes, "Hang on, yesterday you said the cucumbers caused headaches," and it was a lie. The guy throws a cucumber on the kid's head and goes, "Well, how about now?" In the end, cucumbers caused headaches. I hope that little comic brought you joy as much as it did me, which is why I included it. And we are going to get straight into it. Starting off by defining what jargon means, because we realized that jargon was, poster. But even I had to go and look at what jargon means, even though I've heard it being used. So I actually got to the point where I use contextual meaning to say, if we're saying unpacking climate justice jargon, does that then mean maybe words related to the climate justice movement? And I obviously had to do a little bit of research and be like, what does this really mean? And so that's what we're starting off with. So the word refers to the use of specific and somewhat special terms, words, phrases, or sentences in professions, situations, or by a group of people. So the professions could be teachers would use a certain kind of terminology when they're talking to themselves, right, or to each other. Engineers do the same thing. Politicians do the same thing. And so this is what we mean when we say jargon. And these words and phrases are often difficult for others to understand, especially if you're not from that background. If you have not studied politics, if you have not studied the environmental movement, it can be really, really difficult for you to understand a conversation based off the phrases that people who are used to the environment and people who are comfortable in the environment would be using. And one way we can understand the word jargon is to relate it with the word slang. And this just came to me now. And I think some of us here are are familiar with the term tsotsitao, that the way the people who speak tsotsitao is a form of jargon, because if you are not in their circles, you won't understand what they're talking about. It's also the same as groups of friends who could be saying certain things or using certain slang terms to mean something. We've seen this with communities as well. And so slang is very closely related with the word jargon. In other realities and worlds, it actually means the same thing. I've also included an example just so it is more tangible, just so it makes a little bit more sense. It's not just, oh, jargon means slang. No, what this looks like in a real life situation is maybe I would be speaking to Tolly or one of you, and I would say, well, our main goal should be to decolonize the climate justice movement, right? So I'm not really going to go a lot into that, but just look at the highlighted words: decolonize and climate justice movement. Those would be terms that could be associated with the jargon of the climate justice movement. To say, no, but what does decolonization actually mean from an onlooker's perspective, and what does climate justice movement um, actually mean for someone who hasn't heard the terms before, or someone who has heard the terms but has always wondered what it meant? Because I can talk forever. Xoli, if you've got
Oh, I
anything
think you've
to
said it
add.
all, Michelle. We can move on to the next slide.
Awesome.
Yay, cool. So we're going to start with what is climate justice, okay? And I'm sure that all of us, we've been in situations where we're listening to somebody talking, or in a conference or in a workshop, and somebody says something and you are thinking like, what the hell are you saying? Okay. So today it's actually a day where we're gonna be unpacking a lot of those words, but also forefront, I wanted to say that we're not gonna have enough time to unpack everything, but we will talk about that when we are done, because we're going to be putting together a resource list that we can send to you, where you can continue, learning all of these big words. So climate justice, it's basically a term that's been used a lot. I mean, often like when I go to meetings or workshop, I would always hear this word, climate justice. So it's basically a term, and it's really more than a movement, because often this term is associated with a movement, like certain people using it a lot, that acknowledges the climate change. So it basically says climate change can have a differing to social, economic, public health, and other diverse impacts on underprivileged population. Okay? So advocates for climate justice are striving to have inequality addressing heads-on through long-term mitigation and adaptation strategies. So even in that sentence, there's a lot of like big words. So to break it down even more further, so it basically says climate justice begins with recognizing a key group of people, that are affected differently, by climate change. Like, for example, if I stay a Kailicha, in an informal settlement, and I'm sharing a tap with 45, families, and I have a friend who stays in Rondebosch, who has running water in their homes, has a Georgia tank in their backyard. When we have drought, of course, we're going to be impacted differently, because they would have water, just from the click of a hand, whereas I have to probably chew in long chews or spend my last money I have to go buy water. So yeah, so that's when people started talking and say, hey, like, hang on, like climate change doesn't affect us the same. So let's, rather than just looking at the environment or ecology, let's also look at the social impacts, like how it affects our money, how it affects our health, and other impacts.
So in another aspect, it would also, I think if we can simplify it a little bit more, it simply poses the idea that whenever we speak of the climate movement, there is a justice factor to it, mainly because it is closely tied with the social aspect, which is the people. So when people talk about climate justice, we're saying you can't talk about the movement without talking about the people who are affected by climate change and other things that have to do with climate change, like the economies, like the leaders, and all of these things that we see make the movement quite complicated. And also, if you do have any questions, do feel free to like pop in the chat and raise your hand or whatnot, just so we are sure we are on the right track. If also you're taking notes, feel free to stop us and say, hang on, can you please not move on? Because I didn't quite get the spelling of exacerbate, which is also a really huge term for me. I'm like, oh, did I say it right? So we should all be comfortable because we're all learning. I've just learned a new word. It's interesting. And then the next term we want to talk about is a just transition. I think we've heard this a lot in the past few months, in the past few years. We've had people talk about a just transition, and we've mainly heard it spoken about when certain groups of people were particularly speaking to people who are in positions of power when we speak politically. Right? So you heard a lot of people go, "Oh, we want a just transition now." And I was like, "Yes, just transition, but what does it mean?" Um, and I think right off the bat, this just really closely relates to the idea of justice, right? Like just now, we looked at climate justice, and the just transition is closely knitted with that idea because there's an aspect of justice there. Just transition is used, the term itself, or the phrase just transition, is used to bring attention to intersectionality. So intersectionality just means how things are related or how things are linked together. Okay, so it's just to bring attention to intersectionality of the social, the people aspect, the environment, our environment, like the trees, the birds, the animals, the environmental, and the economic or the economy, as it relates to countries, as it relates to communities, provinces, communities of a particular economies of a particular place, as it relates to protecting biodiversity and the expansion of economies. So I'm going to say that one more time because I also had a lot of mini definitions when I was saying that sentence out. But this just aims to bring attention to the intersectionality of the social, environmental, and economic aspects as that relates to protecting biodiversity and the expansion of communities. What this means is as economies get bigger, we are at risk of biodiversity being put on the line. Like we see it with, so here's a very quick example. Deforestation for apartment blocks being built simply because people are getting more and more, because those people form part of an economy who drive in income for a certain country. So we obviously have to have more space to house these people. Or when people flock to urban areas, we have to make space for them. But a lot of the times we don't really think about the impact that has on the biodiversity, on the environment. Like what effect does building a new block of flats have? Well, if we look at where that new block of flats is going to be put, what was there? What are we potentially putting in danger by building this block of flats, right? And so that's what a just transition aims to look at. It was developed by a number of trade unions. So these are people who are in the working class or working class, and they form part of the trade union movement in a bid or in an attempt to make sure that workers' rights and overall well-beings are secured when economies turn to green economies. So what that basically means is a bunch of workers came out and they were like, okay, but how do we ensure that when the economies of these countries go green, when they turn to sustainable means, when they turn to regenerative states, how are we going to make sure that the workers are protected, the workers are not endangered, and the workers are going to have jobs after, say, we close coal mines? How are we going to make sure that we actually make it a point to protect the workers and their livelihoods, right? And so this is when this term came into play, and these people were like, hang on, we definitely want security. So it could be job security, it could be housing, it could, whatever you can think about that has a lot to do with the economy, the environment, justice, and overall making sure that everyone is happy, comfortable, and safe. So the just transition primarily supports what is known as a regenerative economy. This economy is a give and take economy, and it also has a lot to do with people thinking about the things that they consume. It's not just a take, take, take. Like currently, we take from the mines, right? We take from the trees because we need more paper. That is a different, so the regenerative economy is also what we call a circular economy. And I think this might be the perfect point to let you guys know that we will have these resources available later on, also with more terms like circular economy, just so everyone is on the same page, just so everyone understands what is being talked about if you're maybe finding yourself in a conversation. So if you do have the time, please look at the life after coal as it relates to green economies and regenerative economies. And this is particularly talking about a just transition in South Africa. So what happens after we close coal mines? What happens to the workers? And so on and so forth. So that's something that you guys can think about. And Xoli, if you've got anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to repeat what you said, but basically it's just like a balancing act, okay? Because I mean, we all know that the energy transition is happening. I mean, even though it's very slow in our country, but it's just to make sure that like when that transition happens, that it's fair for all, and knowing that there are people now watching closely, making sure that like the economy is not affected, the health, people's well-being. Yeah. So cool. We can move on.
I just had one question. Michelle, you mentioned with injustice that sometimes people think about equal or equality, but in terms of other things, I've also heard people mention equity rather than equality. What are your thoughts? You don't have to go too deep. I just wanted to know if that plays a better role, if equity plays a better role than equality in this transition process.
Okay, so just to make sure that we're all on the same space again. So equality, I am a very visual learner. So I don't know, okay, I think this works better. Let me see if I can find, okay, so this works better, right? I think we can all see what I'm holding here. So equality essentially assumes that when we introduce equality to play, we are making sure that everyone is starting off on the same level, right? I think it's also in the name equal, equality. However, when we speak of equity, we look at the fact that we've got people who have been generationally disadvantaged for centuries, for decades, for years, based off of a lot of things. It could be skin color, it could be demographics, it could be a lot of different factors that contribute to a person being marginalized. So when we speak of equity, we are realizing that um, Gabriel, maybe coming from a rich community, started off here. Okay, so started off at this level. And then maybe Mitchelle, that would be me, started off in a low income community with limited resources. And so maybe if we looked at this equation, this is where I would be starting off, right? Where Gabriel has had a head start in the economy, I would only be getting my foot in the door when Gabriel has had maybe 10 years of working in the same economy. And when we speak of equity, we are taking away the idea that equality relates to everyone, okay? Because we also take into consideration the privileges that come to people based on a lot of different factors. One of them being skin color, another being country of origin, another being community within a country, right? And another being level of education, right? So when the conversation around equity starts speaking, it's to say this person who has been privileged, previously disadvantaged, are we giving that person enough resources to get to a point where we start talking about equality? I haven't lost anyone, have I?
Not at all.
No. Okay. So the conversation then starts becoming about making sure that, and this is in very loose terms, making sure that the starting point is not necessarily the same, because we've also had like people who've had head starts and people who've been tremendously held back due to education levels and a lot of different things. So equity simply says, listen, I understand that I've had 100 resources that have helped me understand the climate justice movement. Now, when we speak equity, I'd come back and say, oh, but I'm just going to talk to Xoli. Oh, excuse me. Um, it's a sign from the universe. Maybe I'd be speaking to Xoli. I'd say, since I've had 100 books about greening the economy, about a just transition, about the climate justice movement, whereas Xoli is a passionate activist, she may not have read the same books that I have. Again, this is in very loose terms. So what I would do when we speak about equity, and obviously this is much bigger than an individual person just saying, listen, I've got a book on just transition. If you'd like to read it, here it is. Oh, and maybe keep it, because then that allows her to give it to the next person. And it obviously becomes a complex discussion when we start talking about politics and we start talking about the power dynamics and we start talking about all these different things. I mean, the conversation will move to greed and all of these different things. But in a nutshell, and in essence, we are talking about equality in a sense where everyone is starting off at equal levels. Equity, on the other hand, realizes that in as much as we might be on the same level, your lack does not necessarily mean that I have to move faster to win. It's simply saying where you lack and I may have it, I'm going to hand it over to you, knowing that you may have the same understanding, and actually note that, oh, maybe Michelle lacks in just precision vocabulary, then giving me a link to some thing that I can go read up on. Does that answer it, Gabriel?
First of all, very, very great. As Yaka also said, very lovely explanation. Thank you for that. It did answer it. And I think now I know in the just transition, we look to equity, not equality.
Absolutely. So if there's anyone else who would like to ask, maybe answer, contributions, any of the sort, feel free to ask about it. So just to reiterate, when it comes to the just transition, we are talking more about equity simply because we understand we're not all starting on the same level, and less about equality because the whole idea of equality still disadvantages some people. And then it's yours, Polly.
Thank you, Michelle. So before we move on, I just want to give an opportunity for people to speak. Our next word is going to be emissions. So Michelle, if we can move on to the next slide. Cool, thank you. So I just wanted to ask, like, if you have heard this word before and in your mind thought like, what the heck is that? Because I've had moments like that, like I'm listening to a talk or in a workshop and somebody says something and I'm like, oh my God, okay. And I wish I had a dictionary to go out. So if that's you, can you unmute yourself and maybe to share a bit like what was happening and how did you feel, when you heard that word, didn't know what it meant, and there was no one around, to give you the definition of that. Okay, Annalisa and Otesh just saying, can you please repeat the question? So I'm asking if you have heard the word emissions before, or maybe any other previous terms that we've just explained. If not, or maybe if yes, so you've heard the word, but you didn't know what it meant, and I'm asking, like, where was that? What was happening? How the word was used, and how did it make you feel, being in that situation, hearing this word and not knowing what it means.
Yes, I think
yes. Okay, sorry, Otesh.
Yes, Ms. Kali, I think that when I first heard the word emissions, it was when I was helping Yola do her video. She spoke about carbon emissions, and later on I asked her, like, what is the meaning behind carbon emissions? So she told me very well and explained from A to Z that carbon emissions are the emissions like carbon dioxide that are left off to the air that affect the ozone layer.
Oh, thank you, Atesh.
I've also had the word emissions, like also like greenhouse emissions, and also like mission to a wow. Yeah. I've
Great, thank you, ladies. Anyone else before we move on?
Well, I have also heard the word like the one Michelle just explained, trust transaction. So I've been hearing the word on mostly on like the YouTube videos of people when they speaking up against climate justice and all of that. And normally I'm on my phone just listening to the videos, watching them. Then I'll normally agree what they're saying, but then when they get to that part, I'm like, okay, I don't understand what you mean by that. But then like true, and I would normally forget to look it up what it means, what are they referring to. But then yeah, there's a lot of videos and like some statements I have seen with the word just transaction.
Oh, thank you, Zika. And on the chat, we have Natasha saying, when I heard just transition, I was wondering what is being transitioned and who is involved. Thank you, Natasha. So hopefully now you know. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna move on and go into emissions. So even though a lot of us know what it means, but we'll again take time to break it down. I think most of us, we know that like carbon is literally like everywhere, like it's in the air we breathe and exhale, the food we eat, the products we produce, we purchase. And guess what? Maybe like some of you guys know or didn't know, but we are also now made up of carbon too. So when we talk about carbon emissions, we are focusing specifically on carbon dioxide or CO2. So naturally, the CO2 or carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere in a tons of ways, like when we driving big cars or when big trucks are driving or from factories or when we are burning stuff. I mean, there's just a lot of ways that the carbon is released to the atmosphere. So it's the largest source of a natural carbon emission. Is from the exchange of carbon dioxide between the ocean and the atmosphere. So, I mean, we all know that the animals and plants, they also like emit CO2 through the process of respiration. So like, like we breathe in, human beings, we breathe in oxygens and we breathe out CO2. And so when these plants and animals decompose, it means to break down. So the organisms within the soil, they respire to produce energy and emit more CO2 into the atmosphere. So in the natural world, like in the environment, it's a natural process, that occurs, that needs to occur. But us human beings, we don't play by the same rules as nature. So when we extract, which means to take away, like refine, transport, or we burn fossil fuels like coal, natural gas, or oil, we release extra carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. We also cut down large expanses of CO2 absorbing trees. Like we know when we actually did our first workshop, we spoke about deforestation as one of the huge causes of climate change. So when we chop down these trees to make a way for agriculture or to build new homes or collect the logs, to build stuff, we also take away, a source of absorbing this CO2 into the atmosphere. So when these trees burn or decompose, they also emit even more CO2. So as I said before, like when you're removing forest, we are also effectively removing the natural system that absorb and store this carbon. And that's why our planet is heating up and there's climate change.
So why would it be important to know a definition such as emissions?
I mean, I think like the other terms we had explored, it's a term that's mostly used, especially like in the definition on what is climate change. So one of the big contributors is the carbon emissions. So it makes sense, when you know what it is, so that when you have an opportunity to explain that to someone else, and you know what you're talking about, things like burning fossil fuels, like coal, gas, and oil. Yeah, cool. So now we're gonna move on. Michelle, are you ready?
Yes, it works now. So the next term that we have is decentralization. And I think before we just sort of dive into this and sort of understand what decentralization means, like I said earlier, I'm a very visual person. And if you look at the bottom there, I have included a bit of a visual to help us understand what decentralization is. So on your left, you will see that all the dots sort of point to a center. This is where the word centralized comes from, because you are looking at somewhat a monopoly, right? Simply meaning the power goes back to one source, or the power goes back to one person, or the decision making goes back to one person, or um, or one unit, if we can put it that way. So it's not always about power in a sense where we physically think of power, but it could be the decision making of an organization, it could be the decision making of a movement such as the climate justice movement. This could also talk about how or who approves what, and how certain things are communicated back into the world for people maybe not from affluent communities, and people who are coming from previously disadvantaged communities or under-resourced communities. Might I also make a special note? I think that for the benefit of everyone, I will be refraining from using, and I think Xoli as well, will be refraining from using underprivileged communities and more using under-resourced communities. And maybe if we have time, we'll break that one down. So yeah, this is essentially the idea around decentralization. So when you look to your right, you get a bit of a picture of what decentralization would look like. So we've taken away the center, or where all the power and the influence goes back to. And what we see is that the dots all have a role to play, and there is sort of like teamwork. There is getting back to a person and saying, oh, hey, but what do you think about this? And a person saying, okay, I think that works. But do you think that it could work better this way? And then that person going, you know what? How about we try together and see where it goes, right? So the whole idea is to take away the centerpiece and ensure that everyone is comfortable, everyone is feeling safe, and everyone feels brave enough to voice their opinions, knowing that their opinions will be taken into account by the group that they will be maybe addressing. So I don't know if everyone or anyone here has heard about the round table. This is essentially a phenomenon where everyone sitting at a round table is equal. Okay? And then the word comes back again, is equal. I'm simply saying that what I'm saying is not going to be more important than what Xoli has to say, or Gabriel and Sika. Then everyone and what they say is important, is equally important. We sort of take away the idea of the power structure when we speak about decentralization, right? And I think that sort of paints a vivid picture of what this term refers to. So it talks, decentralization talks to a process that breaks up and breaks down the idea and structure where power planning and decision making is given to an authoritative group. This could be an authoritative person. I always make like outrageous examples, but in the sense of a country, countries are very centralized in terms of power structures, right? So if we're going to go into an immediate lockdown, Cyril Ramaphosa has to write that off. Okay, so we all can't just decide that it's a good idea, hence we should do it. We could say, okay, it's a good idea, hand it over to an advisory panel who would then make suggestions, which will then go back to Cyril, and Cyril would then say, okay, if I've heard you, maybe let's do this, maybe not. This is like an idea of what centralization is. In a decentralization scenario, and I think we can use smaller organizations and smaller groups of people when we sort of talk about this one. Maybe an organization like ACA, where maybe the white background just is not working for someone, and they'll say, what if we had a solid green, you know? And we have this whole discussion, round table discussion, with maybe illustrations and everything, to say the solid green background is actually a good idea. However, we'd have to change the color of the font as well. We'd also have to make sure that we're using maybe white against the solid green background. And then having everyone write off that idea, simply because, again, it's a team effort and the power is not centralized. It doesn't go back to one person making the decision. It's a team effort. The decision making is people would say unanimous. So you don't know who made the final decision because there's no one person who makes the final decision. So if that sort of makes sense. And in the case of climate justice and the climate movement, it's a process whereby the movement or the actions surrounding it are moved away from just a white lens to a more diverse perspective, which views all partakers as equals, thus contributions are respected and honored. Maybe this is also a conversation for another day, but in recent times, we've seen that the climate justice and the climate movement, where the climate justice aspect comes into the climate movement, is simply because there was centralization of this idea of environmentalism, right? And so climate justice came in and was like, hang on, we can't talk about climate movement and climate change without actually talking about the communities that would be impacted most by climate change, which would be indigenous communities and mostly under-resourced communities, right? Because what we've seen in recent years is a lot of people would come up and they'll talk about the climate movement and they'll talk about what may happen and sort of forget to talk about the people who are being affected, people who have to battle it, and people who are not necessarily given a voice when it comes to this movement. And it has especially come from, the term would be whitewashed. So if you want to do like a really quick exercise, I always do this with people. You just go onto YouTube and you type in zero waste, and a lot of the faces that will come up talking about zero waste would be white faces, right? And of course, I understand that the YouTube is also just a small pool, but we also see it elsewhere. We see it in the media, we see it on televisions, we see it just about anywhere you can think about. We first think about zero waste as a white thing, than we do about it being a community thing and on like a personal level. So you'd find if you're in conversation with someone who has seen or heard about zero waste, they quickly detach themselves because it's a white people thing. And again, this is an idea that has to be explored at a different time, but also for the sake of examples and making sure that this point is driven home about decentralization. Now, when we take decentralization into a case where we look at the climate justice movement and the climate movement as a whole, we are saying, well, it's not only white people who know about this. How about we speak to these indigenous people, these indigenous economies? How about we actually let Africans in Africa, in South Africa, in a certain part in South Africa, speak about their experiences instead of us just having some representative who says ban plastic straws without actually understanding that maybe we actually have a water crisis at such and such a community, and maybe that person hasn't necessarily lived through that experience, so they're not versed enough to talk about it, right? And so that's where decentralization sort of comes into power. And I've also just made a little note to say this note is also closely knitted with decolonization, and we'll figure out why, especially when it comes to the power structure and the historic idea of there being power and there being an inferior and superior group, and why this ties into decentralization. If there are any questions, we are happy to take them. If there are any contributions, we're also very, very happy to take them. Otherwise, if Xoli, you have something to add, then the floor is yours.
Yeah, maybe just to invite everybody to pause, actually, because that was or maybe just to take a minute to check in your own body, maybe to see how you feel. Is your heart pumping hard? Do you feel any sensations around your body? Are you triggered? Just like bringing awareness back to yourself and maybe taking a deep breath, and letting it go. Yeah, and as Michelle said, if there's anyone with a comment or a question, please don't hesitate, raise your hand and we will give you the platform. Zika's hand is up. Zika, go ahead.
I just wanted to say that I had like an idea of what the name meant, like this word means, because not a few days ago I think I had the almost similar conversation with a teacher of mine that well, she was surprised to learn that I'm a vegetarian, and then when I explained my reason being a vegetarian, and then she also said that you're not in the mindset that climate justice or climate movement it's a white thing or white people are mainly involved in. Then we continued having that conversation, and then I had an idea of what decentralization meant before Michelle even explained it. But now that I know, thank you.
Thank you, Zika. Anyone else who's got a question or a comment? Anything that you want to get off your chest after that definition? Okay, we're going to move on because I'm also very much aware of time. So we have about 11 minutes together. So now we're going to move on to decolonize. And as Michelle said, that it's very closely knit, to what Michelle just explained. And especially if you look at, the visual representative of what Michelle showed us, of everything being at the center, and then to the next visual where things are broken down and the dots, are connecting individually. So decolonize has also been used a lot, in the climate space. And often it's just been thrown around, and I'm sure a lot of people are often left not knowing like what it means or how it fits into the climate movement. But basically the basic definition is just like seeking independence or taking away the colonial, the word actually decolonization was first coined by a German economist, Moritz Julius Born, in the 1930s. So before we actually break it down, I've mentioned the word colonial. So a colonization involves like one group taking control of the lands, of the resources, the language, the culture, and the relationship of other groups. Like for example, like in South Africa, we know that we were colonized by the British. They came into South Africa, they took over our land, they took over our resources. Our language was made inferior, like English was the language that was put as superior. I mean, there were a lot of cultures that were lost, and also relationships, with different cultures, different tribes, different people. And so decolonize, it's basically like a process in which a country that was previously colonized or controlled by another country, like us, South Africa, controlled by the British people, becomes politically independent. So we gain our independence in 1994, So the decolonization demands an indigenous framework and a centering of indigenous land, indigenous sovereignty, and indigenous ways of thinking. Okay. So before we actually spoke about, climate justice, in comparison to climate change. So in a very, very long time, climate change was being associated with mainly ecology, like the environment, because of the effects, that it has on the land. But as the years grew, we actually found out that it's not just about ecology, it's also about social justice, because we know that, the communities or the countries that are under-resourced, they are the ones that are mostly affected. Like the example, that I gave earlier, when I was explaining climate justice, that, somebody who stays in Kailicha, who doesn't have access to the land, who doesn't have enough resources, is currently experiencing water scarcity, living in poverty. So when natural disasters hit us, things like drought, they're going to be the ones that are mostly being affected, And I mean, if you look at the world, like the science is currently telling us that we have 10 years, before, well, shit hits the fan. But us as the global South, there's no 10 years, because we are currently living in the effects of climate change. Because if you look at like what they're saying, like the effects, like there's going to be drought, heat waves, natural disasters, we are already experiencing a lot of those things. Like just now, like a couple of months ago, there were floods, in KZN, 2017 in Cape Town, we had the worst drought, close to day zero, And if you again think about like the vulnerable people, who don't again have resources, they are already affected, We can't say to them, oh, I'm sorry, like you've got 10 years. And so when we decolonize, like the climate change, we are saying like, let's shift, let's really shift at looking at the greenhouse gases and the melting ice caps into a civil rights movement where we are looking at human rights, how someone who's already vulnerable is already impacted. And then how can we learn from them how to adapt, so that when the global north is being hit by climate change, then they can learn from us, because we are already living it, we are already building a lot of resilience around climate change. So the term decolonize is just really looking at the bigger system and saying like, we cannot all take the same journey. We can't all go on board in the same train of saying like, yes, there's 10 years, we've got 10 years, because our paths or what we're experiencing currently is not the same. And then also, like, if we can go back before our country was colonized, like how people used to live very close to the land. They know how to tend the land, they know how to look after the resources. And so it's also saying, like, instead of moving forward, let's also like go back. Yes, let's move forward, look at the technology and new ways of like mitigating, the crisis. But also in the same breath, let's also go back, look at our indigenous ways, our indigenous knowledge, how people back in the days used to live from the land, how they used to grow their food, how they used to harvest water, how they used to farm, so that we can both learn from the past and also find new ways of moving forward.
I think you've said it all, and I think we're also looking at time. We've got about 4 minutes left,
Yeah.
Which means at about 6:30, if you do need to hop off, feel more than welcome to do so. Again, the resources would be shared later, the slides and everything, including a link to this workshop if you'd like to look back at it again. Just so everyone feels like we're not holding them because of time. So if you do need to hop off, just like hop off and like tell us later, oh hey, I had to run. But also don't even do that because we know you have to like hop off and stuff. So yeah, I mean that's about it from decolonizing or decolonization. And I think we've also seen how closely knit it is with decentralization, because colonialism and centralization of power were like hand in hand, and now we're breaking down both structures. And so that's where the relationship comes in. With our next bit, which might be the last one before a lot of people have to hop off, is rising sea levels. So I think this is going to go like really quickly. So sea level basically refers to the level of the surface of the sea relative to the earth. So what this basically means is we are looking at where the ocean is, the sea is, relative to the earth. So how many meters are we currently living above sea level? A very good example of this, I'm not sure how, because I know some people live in landlocked environments, and I'm privileged enough to be able to walk to the beach and back. And I know that from where I live, we're looking at about less than 1 meter above sea level, because I can simply just walk, Um, and this is essentially what we're talking about when we speak about sea levels. It's also obviously a different distance from someone who lives on a hill and someone who might even live on Table Mountain. There we are looking at several kilometers above sea level. So when we speak about sea levels, we are simply talking about the amount of kilometers, meters, miles, that whatever point on the earth, so your mountains, your hills, your roads, that point, how many meters above sea level is it actually? Or how many meters, kilometers, miles is the sea relative to that particular point? So that's essentially what sea level refers to. And then when we speak about rising sea levels, which is something that is often spoken about in the climate change movement, we're talking about how the seas, or where the seas currently are at right this minute, are also continuously rising. So it's the continuous increase in the level of the world's oceans due to climate change. Now, I think I just want to take us back a little bit. We spoke about climate change and how climate change, right? This may have been in the earlier workshop, and how climate change simply refers to the earth heating up, right? And when the earth heats up, we know we've got bodies of water, like we can see at the bottom of the slide, we've got bodies of water that have been frozen, they're ice. So it's essentially water that's been stuck in one state for several years. And because the Earth has been heating up, we've seen that that ice has been melting, going into the large bodies of flowing water or the seas that we have, simply meaning we've got more free water. And if we've got more free water, it means that that water needs to be contained somehow. And the way that nature works is that it's going to make space for itself. So again, like I said, I live a walk away from the beach. If anything were to happen and the ice in Antarctica were to heat up faster and release a liquid form of ice, it would mean I might not be able to live where I'm living anymore. And that is the phenomenon that is known as rising sea levels. It's the rising of sea levels. And this is essentially, or particularly as it relates to climate change. And rising sea levels threaten life as we know it, especially especially on coastal regions. Like I've noted that if where I live, if seas were to be higher than they are, I might not be able to live here anymore. But it's not just about me, right? We also need to look and understand that it's not just me who lives in the coastal region. We've got biodiversity, we've got plants, right? We've got animals, we've got all these things that live on the coast that would be threatened if our seas continued to rise at an alarming rate or at a scary rate, meaning it's not just a people problem, it's a life in general problem. The plants that are on the coast that even regulate the temperatures of the earth, and the little animals that live there. It would be like a destruction of ecosystems if we let this happen. But this is essentially what it is, and rising sea levels have resulted in. So a lot of the times we hear will result in, but have resulted in, and will continue to result in flooding. We've seen it in recent times. We've also seen tsunamis and hurricanes and all sorts of things, and as well as storms. So it could be coastal storms, hurricanes, and all of those things. So that is what sea levels, or in particular, rising sea levels, sort of refers to.
Cool. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to carbon diet or footprint. So also this is another word that's always thrown on climate circles, you know, like you must reduce. Often probably you've heard that people saying to you like, oh, you need to reduce your carbon footprint. So just to give you like a visual, you know, example of this. So when you leave a footprint, so you leave a footprint when you walk in the sand or in the mud or when you've got wet feet. So you also leave something called a carbon footprint. But this carbon footprint is very different, you know, to your actual physical footprint that you leave on the sand, because this one, you cannot see it because it's an impact that we leave on Earth. So it leaves a mark just like the ones in the sand or in the mud. It's basically an amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as a result of an activities of a particular individual or organization or community. For another example, you know, when you drive a car, the engine burns fuel or petrol, as we call it in South Africa, which creates a certain amount of CO2, which is carbon dioxide. So depending on its fuel consumption and the driving distance, so the CO2 in the CO2 is basically a chemical symbol for carbon dioxide. So when you hit your house with oil, gas, or coal, then you also generate CO2. Even if you hit your house with electricity, so the generation of the electrical power may also have emitted a certain amount of CO2. So when you buy your food or goods, the production of that food and goods also emit some quantities of CO2.
Is there a way for us to measure our carbon footprint?
Yes. I mean, there's been a lot of tools, developed, especially like on the internet, where you can measure your own carbon footprint. You basically, I mean, there are measurements, that have been put in place, like, when you drive a certain car and you drive like distance, maybe if you're driving from Cape Town to Kailicha, and you put it there and it will ask you like what make of a car, the type of an engine, and then it will tell you exactly, the emissions that have been released to the atmosphere. Also, like if you buy, if you maybe import, if you're one of those person that like to shop online and you import all of your goods, there are also like systems, that can calculate the amount of carbon dioxide that are released, to the atmosphere when you do that, versus, when you buy things local, or grow your own vegetables, or visit your own local market where you're not driving. And also there are solutions, in place, how to reduce your own carbon footprint, like things like I've just mentioned, like, instead of shopping online, you can buy things like locally, visit your local market, or even better, like grow your own stuff, sew your own clothes, because you can do that nowadays. Or yeah.
Thank you.
Climate crisis. This makes me so nervous even talking about like climate crisis, and it should make, I think, every other person nervous as well. And I mean, I think the simplest way to look at this is to notice that our climate is currently in crisis. And I think that's the simplest way, simply because there are a lot of things, right? And so we're going to explore that when defining this bit of work, right? So climate crisis is a term used to describe global warming, climate change, and their consequences. The term has been used to describe the threat of global warming to the planet and to urge aggressive climate change mitigation. Like we mentioned earlier, the threat of global warming is not just to people, it's to ecosystems. It is to existing habitats. We, not just ourselves, right? Like plants and animals, like biodiversity as a whole is threatened. Like life as we know it will change due to global warming and climate change. And the term climate crisis is so that we understand that we're currently living in a crisis, maybe even more impactful than the deadly COVID-19 pandemic that we are still living through, which is in itself a crisis. But the idea is that the climate crisis may even be much bigger. The devastation might even be much bigger than what we've been experiencing, like the loss and all sorts of things that are related to the current crisis. And an example of the climate crisis is that in January of 2020, a bioscience article endorsed over 11,000 scientists worldwide, simply meaning they supported those people, saying that the climate crisis has arrived and that an immense increase in urgency to conserve our planet is needed to avoid untold suffering due to the climate crisis. What these guys, 11 scientists, basically did is they came up and they said, look, it's no longer a story of 10 years. We are experiencing it now. And even though you might not be experiencing it personally, maybe from where you live, there are numerous places and people who are currently feeling the brunt of the climate crisis, who are currently being devastated by climate change, global warming, and the threat it brings to their very own livelihoods, as well as other biodiversity that isn't necessarily humans. So it's, again, I cannot stress this enough, that it's not just a human thing. It's not the climate crisis is upon us, so where can I migrate to? It's more like, how can I make sure that the community in which I live, with everything that is in it, is prepared to fight the climate crisis, as well as educate the next maybe community on how this would work. So these scientists simply stated that it's an emergency now. We really, really need to try and save our planet, so that we can avoid people and communities. And when I say communities, I'm talking about everything, animals and plants involved. To what can we do? We need to act to avoid communities suffering at the hand of climate change. And I think at this point, it's more or less about how can we avoid. It's more about how can we make sure that communities are geared to deal with the climate crisis, right? So more like how can they adapt, more around the adaptation conversation. So the term is applied by those who believe. The term is applied by those who believe it evokes the gravity of the threat of the planet, that the planet faces from continued greenhouse gas emissions, and can help spur the kind of political willpower that has long been missing from climate advocacy. When, again, I mean, very simple with climate crisis in that sentence is simply saying the threat that climate change is putting on the planet, people, governments, countries, it is very visible. Because again, I mean, if anyone uses a crisis with you, you're going to lose your head. And that is essentially what is said here. Saying climate crisis is an attempt also for political powers to say, look, we are in an emergency, and so these are the policies we are putting in place to ensure that we don't deal with what is projected that people will deal with in those politicians' hands, in a sense. So it's a chance to give people who have the power to act using the power that they have. Calling climate change a crisis could have an even stronger impact, which is something that I've just explained in terms of politics. And the thing is that a study has shown that the term does invoke a strong emotion. So it forces an emotion out of people so that they actually respond to the climate crisis or climate change as a crisis. And it helps in communicating a sense of urgency. But other people argue that this response may be counterproductive and may cause a backlash effect due to perceptions of alarmist exaggerations. So when a person says we're living through a climate crisis, other people might simply go, no, we're not, and not act. But also we have heard about something called the climate anxiety, or anxiety as it relates to climate activism and all of that. So just calling it a crisis might make people take a step backwards when we're actually trying to move forward. But the basic idea is that we are in a crisis, and we should act, and how we act will result in possibly a lesser hurtful future for all of us and the world at large.
Thank you, Michelle. And now we're going to be exploring our last, well, not last, but like in this workshop, our last slide, which is climate change mitigation. And before I actually tackle this last slide, I just want to say again that we will be compiling, a list of these words, including like more that we didn't have time to cover today. So not to worry, if you came here with a list of words that you wanted us to cover. So climate change mitigation, always used, especially in the political scene, people in parliament, they always talk about mitigation. But this mitigation really just refers to the effort of reducing the impact or brutality or extremity of something. So we all know that climate change is happening and people are being affected, So this word has been put in place where we can look at ways on how to reduce our own CO2, so that we are not talking about 10 years of effects, but we can then increase those years. So when climate change mitigation is referred to, it's basically the conversation that tends to be about nations or individuals paying more attention to the environment and what can be done to ensure that climate change does not result in complete loss of habitat, livelihoods, or so, because as we all know, and Michelle has been saying a lot, that it's just not about the planet. I mean, there's biodiversity, human beings that are already affected, by climate change. So this is basically simply to actually say, like, let's act, and let's put together like actions which aims to reduce the risk of this loss. So it is important to note that the conversation is surely leaning more towards adaptation, because of the reasons that I've been mentioning a lot, is that now there are a lot of vulnerable communities, countries, especially us as Africans, who are already experiencing the effects of climate change. Because what mitigation does, it says, oh, it hasn't happened, so let's look at how we can reduce it, whereas adaptation is saying, well, it's happening already. What can we learn from the people that are already experiencing, this climate change in terms of resilience and also like indigenous knowledge, and find ways to adopt. So when we're experiencing drought, instead of coming up with maybe ways of reducing water consumption, it's to say, well, I mean, how about we find ways on adapting? Maybe we look at, indigenous knowledge on how to harvest water, maybe looking at people, that are living in areas where there's already water scarcity. How are these people surviving, and how can we take some of those learnings and apply them to our day-to-day lives? So adaptation simply refers to a process of adjusting to the current and expected, further effects of climate change. Yeah.
So we've come to the end of our workshop where we unpacked some climate justice jargon. We looked at what jargon really meant, and we maybe touched on a little bit what unpacking even was. But most importantly, we tried going over some of the things or some of the words and phrases and terms that we've heard in the space that we may not always be familiar with. We looked at the just transition, we looked at climate justice, we looked at what the climate crisis was. We also looked at decolonization and decentralization. We looked at what sea levels were. We also looked at what rising sea levels were. And although it was not one of our formal definitions, we definitely looked at intersectionality and how it relates to the climate activism space. And some of our goals were to bring a level of comfort to the climate activism space, especially with climate activists who will go out into the world feeling more comfortable and ready to tackle some conversations simply because they understand the words that are being used and understand how to use those words. We also wanted to make sure that we all understood what these words meant, and we hope we have brought that and we have realized that dream that was a dream, and I think now it's a reality. So thank you everyone for joining us for today's session. I am Michelle, your co-facilitator.
I'm Xoli, the other co-facilitator. And thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again next month when we are tackling another theme around climate change.